Emma Carter was fired. Clean out her locker. The morning had started like any other at Harbor Brew, the small cafe she'd managed for years, nestled in a town just outside the naval base. It wasn't just a coffee shop, it was a sanctuary. Emma had watched veterans come in, some carrying invisible wounds, seeking solace in the familiar warmth of a cup of coffee and a place where they were understood. That's why she started Veterans Coffee Hour every Wednesday morning, a simple idea that had grown into a tradition. Jake Parker was one of those regulars, a young veteran no older than 30, who barely spoke when he first walked through the door 2 years ago. His German shepherd, Max, was always by his side, a silent guardian keeping his owner grounded. Emma had watched over time as Jake went from standing in the corner, hands shaking, to finally sitting with the others, sharing quiet conversations, small victories, hard-won battles. She knew Max wasn't just a dog, he was a lifeline. That morning, the cafe buzzed with familiar faces. The smell of fresh coffee filled the air, the warmth radiating from those who came to lean on each other. Then a voice cut through the peace like a knife. "Dogs aren't allowed in here." "Health code." Heads turned. The room went silent. Jake's entire body tensed as his hand tightened on Max's leash. Emma recognized the signs immediately. The way his breathing changed. The way his posture locked up. Panic. She turned to the source of the voice. Richard Mills, the new health inspector, a man known for shutting down businesses without warning. A stickler for rules and an even bigger fan of his own authority, he stood near the entrance. Arms crossed, eyes already scanning the cafe like a battlefield. He was ready to conquer. "He's a service animal," Emma said firmly, stepping forward. "Under federal ADA law, service dogs are allowed in all public spaces." Richard scoffed. "Law or no law, I don't want dog hair in people's food. Either the dog goes or this place gets shut down." A slow tremor ran through Jake's hand. Max leaned into his leg, watching him, keeping him steady. Emma clenched her jaw. She'd seen this before, with her father in the years after his last tour. The nightmares, the sudden panics, the moments when the world closed in on him. And she'd seen what happened when no one stood up for him. She wasn't going to let it happen again, not in her cafe. Emma didn't hesitate. "He has a right to be here. It's federal law. The ADA regulations protect service animals." Richard smirked, still arms crossed like a man who'd decided he wasn't going to lose this fight. "I don't care about your so-called rights. Here's my law. Either the dog leaves or this place gets shut down." Silence, a thick, suffocating kind of silence. The familiar hum of the cafe, the hissing espresso machine, the quiet, overlapping conversations were gone. No one moved. No one dared to speak. Eyes flicked between Emma and Richard, between Jake and the door, waiting for someone to back down. Jake's fingers twitched on Max's leash. The dog, sensing his distress, pressed closer. A low whine escaped Max's throat. Not loud enough to be aggressive, just enough to remind his owner that he was there, that he was real. Panic. Emma had seen it before, so many times in her father, in other veterans, in men who'd seen things no one should ever see. Her hands balled into fists at her sides. "My dad was a Marine," she said, her voice even, steady, but coated with something dark underneath. "I grew up knowing what veterans go through. I won't stand here and watch you treat them like they don't belong." Richard's lips curled in amusement. "Then don't stand here." The words didn't quite register at first, but then a sharper voice, her regional manager's, cut through the silence like a bullet. "Emma, stop!" She turned, but the moment she saw his face, she knew what was coming. Panic, fear, desperation. Not for Jake, not for the veterans, but for the cafe, the business, the bottom line. "There's nothing I can do about this," he said, shaking his head. "Richard has the authority. If we fight this, this place gets shut down. You're forcing my hand." He swallowed, jaw clenched. "Before you force anything, you're fired." A sharp intake of breath from someone in the cafe, a muttered curse from one of the veterans. But no one spoke up. No one stepped in. Emma stood frozen, heart pounding in her chest, but her hands steady as she reached for her apron ties and yanked them off. 6 years, 6 years of early mornings, memorizing every customer's order, making sure this place felt like home, gone in an instant for doing the right thing. She turned to Jake, his face blank, unreadable, though she knew what was happening beneath the surface. The spiral, the doubt, the thoughts like her father used to have. Maybe I am a burden. Maybe people don't really care. No, this isn't your fault. Her voice was firm but gentle, eyes locked on Jake, ignoring Richard, ignoring the regional manager, ignoring the pressing silence from every corner of the cafe. You belong here. You'll always belong here. Jake blinked, swallowed. Max nudged his leg as if in agreement. Emma turned back, grabbed her bag from behind the counter, and walked toward the door. No one stopped her. She stepped outside into the crisp morning air. The world was still moving, oblivious to the fact that hers had just changed. She had no backup plan, no savings cushion. Rent was due next week, and she'd just quit the only job she truly cared about. A lump formed in her throat, but she forced it down. Then a sound, a low rumble in the distance. Then another and another, the kind of sound that sent vibrations through the ground. The kind of sound that made people turn their heads. Engines, not one, not two, dozens. She turned slowly, walking until she could see the parking lot clearly. And then she stopped breathing. Lined up in perfect formation, standing next to their vehicles, were Marines, real ones, in uniform, serious as hell. And leading them, walking straight toward the cafe door, was Colonel James Pierce. Emma sat in her car, gripping the steering wheel so hard her knuckles turned white. The shock of it all hadn't quite settled. Fired, just like that, for doing the right thing. 6 years of dedication wiped out in an instant. The weight of it hadn't crushed her yet, but she could feel it creeping in, waiting to settle in her chest like a stone. She let out a sharp breath, pressing her forehead against the steering wheel, her mind reeling. What would Dad do? The thought hit her harder than she expected. Her father had lived by a simple rule: always stand up for what's right, no matter the cost. But that was easy to say when the cost wasn't her entire livelihood. Her phone buzzed in the passenger seat, pulling her from her thoughts. She glanced down. Unknown number. Get out here. We need to talk. Her stomach tightened. Before she could process it, there was a tap on her window. She turned, and then she froze. Standing outside in the middle of the parking lot were Marines, not one, not two, at least 24, in full dress uniform, standing in formation, boots planted firmly on the asphalt, and leading them was Colonel James Pierce. Her breath hitched. She recognized him instantly, a highly decorated, highly respected officer, a legend among those who had served. He'd been her father's commanding officer, one of the last people to speak to him before his final mission. Her heart pounded as she fumbled with the door handle, stepping out slowly. The morning air suddenly felt too sharp, too heavy. Pierce walked toward her, his steps measured, his gaze unreadable. She forced herself to meet his eyes, though she had no idea what was happening. Then, without a word, he extended his hand. She hesitated for a half-second before taking it. His grip was firm, solid, the kind of handshake that said, "Pay attention. This is important." He held her gaze for a long moment before speaking. "We've been looking for you." Her pulse quickened. "What?" Behind him, the other Marines stood motionless, like statues. Pierce nodded toward the cafe. "Do you know what happens when you stand up for the right people?" She swallowed, unsure what to say. "You find out who's willing to stand up for you." She barely had time to process his words before another voice called her name. She turned. "Jake?" He stood near the cafe entrance, looking shaky but different, stronger. He wasn't hunched over, wasn't pulling his hoodie over his face like he used to when attention was on him. And he wasn't alone. Several veterans had gathered behind him, the men and women she'd served coffee to for years. Some she barely knew. Others she'd watched slowly open up, like Jake had. Her throat tightened. "What's all this?" she finally asked. Pierce chuckled softly. "Someone filmed what happened. A customer. It got to the base." Her stomach dropped. The whole base had seen it. He nodded. "And it went viral, Carter. Thousands shared it. Command saw it, the brass saw it, and let's just say, he glanced toward the cafe where the regional manager and Richard Mills stood, looking ashen-faced. Some people are in big trouble. She turned back to him, her mind reeling. They fired me, she whispered, more to herself than to him. I don't, I don't have a job anymore. Pierce's expression didn't change. Yes, you do, she frowned. What? We've been looking for someone to head our Veterans Outreach Program, someone who understands both customer service and what it means to fight for what's right. We need someone to work directly with the troops to help them transition back to civilian life. Someone like you. The words hit her like a wave. A job, not just any job, the kind she'd never dared to dream of. Her mouth opened, but no words came out. Pierce smiled gently. Take your time, Carter, but just so you know. He turned slightly, gesturing toward the group of veterans still standing near the cafe. You've got an army behind you. The weight of those words settled in her chest, heavier than any fear she'd carried just moments before. She looked at Jake again, the way he stood a little taller, the way he nodded at her as if silently telling her she'd done the right thing. The right thing, and when she did the right thing, even when it cost her everything, sometimes the world had a way of paying you back. Her fingers trembled slightly as she exhaled, her voice steadier than she expected when she finally spoke. Where do I start? Her first day at the Veterans Outreach Program felt like stepping onto a battlefield. Emma's office, small and tucked away inside the military base, was new to her, but the stakes were high. This wasn't just about coffee and conversation anymore. This was about real change, about proving she belonged here. She'd spent years turning Harbor Brew into a sanctuary for veterans, but now she was expected to build something bigger, something lasting, a program that could bridge the gap between returning service members and the civilian world they often struggled to rejoin. But not everyone trusted her. Who put the coffee lady in charge? She heard the whispers before her first meeting even started. Some of the officers, senior ranks who'd spent decades in uniform, barely glanced at her as they walked by. She has no experience with military operations. This isn't a customer service job. She won't last a month. She clenched her jaw, forcing herself to keep moving, ignoring the dismissive looks, the quiet snickers behind her back. Fine. Let them doubt her. She'd heard this before, the same tone her mother had used when Emma chose the cafe over a corporate career, the same looks people gave her when she spent more time listening to veterans than turning tables faster. They didn't know her, but they would. Emma threw herself into the work. She met with veterans every day, listening to their struggles, their frustrations. Some needed job training, some just needed someone to talk to, and others, like Jake, needed help finding their way back to a sense of normalcy. She expanded the program beyond just counseling. She networked with local businesses willing to hire veterans. She brought in mental health professionals to offer free therapy sessions. But the biggest fight? The service dogs. She saw it immediately, the way some officers looked at Max and the other therapy dogs, the way red tape and protocol constantly got in the way of progress. Military bases aren't pet-friendly, one administrator told her with a tight smile. They're not pets, she countered. They're soldiers, and they deserve the same respect. It took weeks of pushing, endless paperwork, and one particularly heated debate with a general, but Emma finally made it happen. A dedicated space on base for veterans with service animals, a safe, quiet area where they could train, relax, and simply exist without judgment. The first time she walked into that space, seeing Jake sitting with Max, chatting with another veteran, she felt something shift inside her. This was working. 6 months flew by in a blur of long nights, frustrating meetings, and tiny victories that felt enormous. And then came the real test, the Veterans Integration Conference, a chance to prove that this program mattered. The event was held in a massive hall packed with military officials, business owners, and veterans. Emma had spent months preparing for this. She lined up speakers, prepped stats, and locked down every detail. But she wasn't the one people had come to see. Jake was. She still remembered the day she'd asked him to speak, the way he'd immediately tensed up, his eyes darting toward the exits as if searching for an escape route. I can't, his voice barely louder than a whisper. I'm not good with crowds. She just nodded. I know. She hadn't pushed him, but 2 days before the event, he'd come to her office. I'll do it. And now, as he stepped onto that stage, Emma held her breath. The room was silent, hundreds of eyes locked on the young man who used to be unable to order a coffee without shaking. He gripped the microphone, took a breath, and then, "My name is Jake Parker," he said, his voice strong, "and I never thought I'd be standing here." The next 5 minutes changed everything. Jake spoke about his struggles, about how the program, how Emma had given him back a piece of himself he thought he'd lost. And when he finished, his voice cracking slightly on the last words, the room erupted in applause. Emma couldn't move for a second. She just watched. Military officers, high-ranking officials, and business owners stood clapping. Jake stepped back from the microphone, his hands shaking, not from fear, but from something else. Pride. She wiped her eyes, letting out a shaky breath. And as she looked around the room, as she saw the rows of men and women who had served like her father had, she saw him, not physically, but in every veteran who had ever walked through her cafe door, in everyone who just needed someone to believe in them. Her father had always told her doing the right thing wasn't always easy. That day, she'd proved him right, and for the first time, she truly understood what he meant. A year later, Emma walked into a cafe just a few blocks from the base. It smelled familiar, the rich aroma of freshly brewed espresso, the gentle hum of conversation mixed with the occasional clinking of mugs. For a brief moment, it transported her back to Harbor Brew, back to the life she once had. But things were different now. She wasn't just the woman who'd been fired for standing up for what was right. She wasn't just the former manager of a coffee shop. She was a person with purpose, someone who had fought for change and won. The bell above the door jingled as she stepped inside. The warmth of the cafe enveloped her like an old friend. She wasn't there for coffee, though. She had a meeting. A business owner had contacted her requesting training on ADA compliance for service animals. It was part of her job now, educating local businesses about the very thing that had once cost her her job. She scanned the room looking for her contact when something caught her eye. A young barista behind the counter, barely out of his 20s, standing stiffly as he faced an older man in a faded military jacket. "I'm sorry, sir, but dogs aren't allowed inside," the barista said, his voice uncertain. "It's a health code policy." The veteran's shoulders tensed. Beside him, a golden retriever in a service dog vest sat patiently, sensing the shift in energy. Emma felt something tighten in her chest. The scene was too familiar. She didn't hesitate. She stepped forward, placing a gentle hand on the young barista's shoulder. "Let me explain something to you," she said, her voice calm but firm. The barista blinked at her, startled. She turned to the veteran, offering a warm smile. "Sir, you're welcome here, and so is your service dog." The veteran looked at her, hesitant at first, but then nodded slowly. She glanced back at the barista, who still stood frozen. "I know you're just following the rules you were given, but federal law states that service animals aren't pets. They're essential medical aids. They're allowed in public places, including restaurants and cafes." The young man swallowed, looking unsure. I didn't know that." "That's why I'm here," she smiled, "to make sure everyone does." The cafe owner, having overheard the exchange, stepped in with an apologetic nod. "We'll schedule that training right away, Ms. Carter. I appreciate you stepping in." She nodded, glancing back at the veteran. "Can I offer you a cup of coffee?" The man hesitated, then smiled. "That'd be great." As he found a seat, Emma exhaled, feeling something settle inside her. A circle closed. She'd been fired once for standing up for a veteran in his service dog. Now she was the one making sure it never happened again. Later that day, she returned to her office, her own office, inside the Veterans Outreach headquarters. The walls were lined with photos of the program's success stories, veterans who had found jobs, families reunited, men and women who had rediscovered their purpose. But at the center of it all, hanging right behind her desk, was a single frame picture, her father. Below it, a plaque with the words, "When you stand up for what's right, the right people will stand up for you." She smiled. The past year had been a whirlwind. The Veterans Outreach Program had grown beyond anyone's expectations. Emma had worked tirelessly, expanding resources, bringing in experts, and fighting for policy changes to better serve returning service members. More veterans had access to therapy, more businesses were actively recruiting them, and most importantly, there was a community that no longer made them feel like they had to fight alone. She thought of Jake, of how much things had changed for him. 6 months ago, he'd stood on a stage in front of hundreds, sharing his story for the first time. Now he was working as a mentor for other veterans struggling with PTSD. And Max, he was still by Jake's side. But now, instead of guiding him through panic attacks, he was there to help others find their way back. It was a ripple effect, one act of courage changing everything. And Emma knew it wouldn't stop there. That night, as she locked her office door and stepped outside, she tilted her head back, gazing up at the sky. She used to think losing her job at Harbor Brew was the worst thing that had ever happened to her. Now she realized it was the best thing because it had led her here, to something bigger, to something that mattered. She pulled out her phone, scrolling through the latest messages from business owners requesting training, from veterans thanking her for the program. She clicked on a new message from Jake. Got another veteran interested in the program. He's struggling, but I think we can help him. Let me know when you're free. She smiled, typing back quickly. Always. Because this was where she belonged. In a world that often values silence over confrontation, standing up for what's right can feel like an uphill battle. Emma's journey proves that courage isn't just about speaking up. It's about refusing to back down, even when the cost seems too high. How many times have we witnessed someone struggling, knowing we should help but hesitating out of fear? Fear of consequences, fear of judgment, fear of losing something we've worked so hard to achieve. But the truth is, the cost of silence is often greater than the cost of doing the right thing. Her story is a reminder that the smallest act of kindness, one moment of bravery, can change not just one life, but many. What if she had chosen to stay silent that day? What if she had let fear dictate her fate? Instead, she trusted her values, and in the end, the right people stood up for her. Kindness always comes back around. So I ask you, have there been moments in your life when you stood up for something important? Or when someone stood up for you? Share your stories in the comments, and if you believe the world needs more voices challenging injustice, more stories inspiring action, hit subscribe, because here, we don't just tell stories, we create movements. Are you ready to be part of something bigger?